Before we begin, I would just ask you to note in the comments which city you are watching from and what time it is there now, as if you were leaving a discreet mark on this file. In February 1904, a name began to appear with irregular insistence in the railroad records of the southern United States: Smoky Ridge, not as a final destination, nor as an official connection point, but as a side note, handwritten, almost always in the corner of the pages. For some clerks, it was just a repeated mistake. For others, it was a detail too disturbing to ignore. Smoky Ridge did not appear on tourist maps of the time. It was a discreet elevation on the edge of the Smoky Mountains, surrounded by dense forest, persistent fog, and dirt roads that easily disappeared after prolonged rains. The nearest village was almost 2 hours away by wagon, and even then, few remembered the exact route. The houses were spaced apart, made of old wood, with narrow porches and roofs worn by time. There was no central square, nor a church in continuous operation. Only an older, larger building, elevated above the others, a 2-story residence whose attic was visible from a distance like a dark eye facing the valley. That is where this story begins. The remaining documents are fragmented: travel tickets, notes in personal diaries, incomplete lodging records, and above all, testimonies collected years later, when memory had already been eroded by time and fear of error. Still, when placed side by side, these fragments form a disturbing pattern. Between March 1903 and November 1904, 38 travelers, men and women, most alone, some in small groups, passed through Smoky Ridge. All were last seen entering the same property. None were seen leaving. The indirect protagonist of this story is not a single man, nor a single family, but a place. The house on the north slope, known in local records only as the High Attic Residence. It belonged to Elias Crowell, a middle-aged widower, listed as a traveling merchant in old censuses, but rarely seen outside his property. The few neighbors who mentioned him described him as polite, reserved, excessively quiet, someone who spoke little but listened too much. Crowell lived with a distant relative, possibly a niece according to a baptism recorded in 1889, although this relationship was never formally confirmed. There were no permanent employees. Still, travelers reported in letters and diaries that the place offered temporary shelter, a safe roof, a hot meal, a rest before continuing the journey along the mountain trails. In the early 20th century, this type of hospitality was not uncommon in isolated regions. Improvised guest houses appeared and disappeared without a trace. What makes Smoky Ridge different is not the welcome. It is the silent repetition of farewells that never happened. The reports described the environment with surprising accuracy. The constant creaking of wood at dusk, the smell of old firewood mixed with the dampness of the fog, the dim light of the lamps, always positioned away from the windows, and above all, the attic, a space mentioned in at least 12 different records, a place to store belongings, to rest, to sleep away from the cold floor. None of these accounts speak of explicit fear. None mention screams, violence, or conflict. What appears repeatedly is a feeling that is difficult to name, a slight discomfort, a strangeness too small to justify immediate escape, but persistent enough to be noted. The first officially recognized disappearance occurred in April 1903. A traveler named Thomas A. Whitmore, a tool salesman, was reported missing after failing to arrive at the next village. His name appeared days later in a notebook found on the railroad tracks, with a single sentence: "Stayed at Smoky Ridge, went up to the attic at dusk." Nothing else. At the time, the case was treated as a detour or accident in the mountains. Only years later, when other names began to accumulate, did someone notice something that had been in plain sight from the beginning. No records of departure, no farewell notes, no reports of resuming the journey, only entries, always entries. And at the center of all these records, repeated in different handwritings, was the same seemingly mundane detail: room available in the attic. It is from this simple, almost innocent line that the archives begin to become dangerously silent. To understand what led so many travelers to accept shelter at Smoky Ridge, one must return to the rhythm of life at the beginning of the century. Between 1900 and 1904, the roads that cut through the Smoky Mountains were used by peddlers, carpenters, small traders, itinerant teachers, and widows seeking new beginnings in emerging cities. Traveling alone was not uncommon. Sleeping on private property was even less so. Records from the time show that Smoky Ridge appeared to many as a convenient solution. The trail that ran along the north slope was treacherous on foggy days. Horses tired quickly. Night fell early. When the light disappeared behind the trees and the cold began to rise from the ground, the silhouette of Crowell's house became visible long before any other sign of human shelter. Letters found decades later helped to reconstruct this first contact. In one of them, written by Margaret H. Sloan, a teacher traveling to take over a rural school in Tennessee, we read, "The house appears out of nowhere, tall, dark, but solid. The man who opened it did not smile but spoke politely. He said there was room upstairs." Margaret never reached her destination. Her letter was posted days earlier, in another city. The routine at the residence followed an almost mechanical pattern, according to later statements from neighbors. Elias Crowell was rarely seen during the day. He bought groceries once a week, always at the same time, always with the same list: flour, dried beans, coffee, kerosene, never fresh meat, never new clothes, never objects that indicated multiple permanent guests. Still, people kept coming. Travelers reported simple but hot meals. Silence during dinner. Crowell's relative, identified in some records only as L.C., hardly spoke. She moved around the house with light steps, avoiding direct eye contact. There is no evidence of aggression or exaggerated hospitality, just a strange neutrality, which some interpreted as shyness, others as tiredness. The attic was always mentioned as the best option for overnight stays. "Drier," said Crowell. "Less cold," he added. Access was via a narrow old wooden staircase that creaked unevenly, a sound described in at least 5 different accounts. Upstairs, according to the descriptions, there were simple mattresses, thick blankets, and a constant smell of dust mixed with old smoke. No traveler describes the attic as threatening. On the contrary, many considered it safe enough to store belongings and rest deeply after days on the road. In a diary attributed to Samuel R. Keaton, we read, "I heard the wind beating on the roof tiles. The house creaks as if it were breathing. I fell asleep too quickly." These everyday details are important because they show what was not there. There were no obvious signs of danger. There were no known conflicts between Crowell and the community. There was no history of violence associated with the place. What there was isolation, silence, and a house that functioned outside the normal rhythm of the region. Some neighbors said years later that they never saw large groups leaving the residence, but they also did not remember frequent visitors. Smoky Ridge was a place where no one observed too much, where each family took care of their own property, where excessive questions were considered rude. There are, however, small clues that only gained weight in retrospect. A cart driver claimed to have heard footsteps in the attic at unusual times, even when there were no visible guests. Another reported lights on upstairs for several nights in a row, with no one seen the next day. A third mentioned a strange smell coming from the hillside after periods of heavy rain, something he associated at the time with dead animals in the woods. None of these reports were formalized at the time. They were casual comments, made on porches, soon forgotten. Life went on. The roads continued to welcome weary travelers, and Crowell's house remained there, immobile, offering shelter as always. What is most striking about the documents is the almost automatic trust of the travelers. Few recorded any real doubts. Few showed any intention of continuing their journey even though they were tired. The decision to go up to the attic seemed natural, almost inevitable, as if it were the last logical step after a long day. In November 1904, a railroad agent noted something unusual when reviewing unused tickets. Next to several names, he wrote the same observation: intermediate destination, Smoky Ridge. Passenger did not return. It was the first time that someone outside the community began to realize that these were not isolated cases, that there was a sequence, a discrete but consistent pattern, and that all paths, when followed carefully, led back to the same place, to the same staircase, to the same attic. The reconstruction of the collective disappearance is not based on a single event, but on a succession of almost identical nights. What the archives allow us to state with some certainty is that the last reliable records of at least 23 of the 38 travelers occurred inside the house, a few hours before they went up to the attic. The final reports follow a pattern that is disturbing precisely because of its normality. On the night of August 17, 1904, Henry Caldwell, a fabric salesman from North Carolina, wrote a short letter to his wife. The envelope was never sent, but was found years later among papers stored in a trunk at the Asheville station. The letter ends with a simple sentence. The owner of the house pointed to the attic. He said, "The wind doesn't bother you there." The handwriting shows no sign of haste. There are no signs of fear. Most travelers describe the same ritual: a quiet dinner, hand-washed dishes, lamps extinguished one by one. Crowell rarely accompanied guests upstairs. He would simply point to the stairs and wait silently until the sound of footsteps disappeared above. What happened next is where the records become fragmented. Some diaries mention noises in the house during the early hours of the morning, crackling louder than usual, a rhythmic creaking, different from the sound of the wind. Others speak of a physical sensation that is difficult to explain, as if the air were too heavy, or as if the space were smaller than it appeared at first glance. One traveler wrote that he woke up with the impression that someone was walking beneath the floor, even though he knew everyone was asleep. No record mentions a struggle. None describe attempts to escape. The last piece of material evidence associated with several disappearances is the record of the attic at dawn the next day, or rather the absence of it. Neighbors who passed by the road report that on several occasions the house seemed empty in the morning. No movement, no sound. The attic ladder was retracted as if it had not been used the night before. In September 1904, a local hunter claimed to have seen Crowell burning something at the back of the property, shortly after a night of heavy rain. He said the fire was small, controlled, and that the smell was unlike ordinary wood. He did not mention this to anyone at the time. Only many years later, when he no longer lived in the area. The most detailed and perhaps most disturbing episode involves Elijah Moore, a 26-year-old man who was traveling with a friend, Caleb Wright. The two arrived together at Smoky Ridge in late October. They were seen talking to Crowell on the porch. Only Elijah entered the house. Caleb continued on his journey, claiming he was late. Days later, Caleb reported to an officer that Elijah intended to meet him in the next town. That never happened. In testimony taken years later, Caleb described the last conversation he had with his friend. He seemed relieved to find shelter. He said he would sleep in the attic and leave early. When asked why he didn't stay, Caleb replied simply, "I didn't like the silence." This sentence is underlined in the original report. Subsequent investigations attempted to reconstruct the structure of the house. An engineer who visited the site after the final disappearance described the attic as deeper than the external size of the residence indicated. There were makeshift internal divisions, reinforced beams at specific points, and marks on the floor that did not correspond to the common use of a resting space. Nothing there, however, indicated an obvious mechanism. No visible trap, no formally identified secret passage. Just an environment that seemed to have been adapted over time, layer upon layer, as if it had served different purposes. The night of the last recorded disappearance, November 2, 1904, was described as particularly cold. A traveler named Robert Ellison signed Crowell's makeshift guestbook shortly before nightfall. His name is the last on the list. The next morning, the house was closed. Crowell was nowhere to be seen. His relative L.C. had also disappeared. The attic was locked from the outside. When authorities finally managed to enter days later, they found the space empty. No bodies, no personal belongings, just mattresses lined up too neatly for casual use, folded blankets, and an unlit lamp in the center of the floor, as if it had been left there on purpose. The report ends this stage with a dry observation, written in the margin by an investigator. There are no signs of departure. It was the last piece of confirmed evidence, and paradoxically, the one that raised the most questions. When Elias Crowell's absence was finally noticed, there was no longer any urgency, only delay. The official notice was only issued because a local merchant found the prolonged closure of the property strange and decided to inform the county sheriff. Until then, the idea that something serious could have happened seemed too far-fetched for a place accustomed to silence. The initial searches were superficial. 2 officers, accompanied by residents, walked through the still-closed house, noting what they saw without really understanding what they were looking for. There were no signs of forced entry. No furniture was out of place. The kitchen was clean. The floor was swept. The cabinets were organized. The general feeling described in the report was that the residents had left of their own accord, as if the house had been carefully closed up. The attic, however, required more time. As they climbed the narrow staircase, the officers noticed something that was not in the previous records. The floor had been recently reinforced with newer wooden boards fitted over an old base. In some places, the floor seemed thicker than normal. Not enough to raise immediate suspicion, but enough to cause discomfort. One of the officers wrote that the air there was different, more stagnant, not heavy but closed in, like a room that was rarely opened during the day. There were marks in the dust, irregular lines, as if objects had been dragged repeatedly, always in the same direction. None of these objects were found. The search extended up the hillside, through the surrounding woods, along familiar trails. Dogs were brought in days later, but the trail always ended at the same point, the base of the house. It did not extend into the forest. It did not follow any road. It simply disappeared. It was at this point that the statements began to take on new weight. Residents began to remember details they had previously ignored. One neighbor stated that Crowell used to dig in the yard after heavy rains. Another mentioned that the basement, rarely mentioned in the initial reports, was always locked, even when there were guests. A third spoke of muffled sounds coming from the house during certain early mornings, but insisted they never sounded like screams, just like something being moved slowly. The most disturbing revelation came weeks later, when a former railroad employee presented a notebook forgotten at the back of a closet. In it were unofficial lodging notes written in pencil, dates, names, and next to some of them small marks, vertical lines grouped in 5s. There was no explanation, just the count, 38 marks in all. The hypothesis that took hold was not that of impulsive murder, nor of a crime motivated by hatred or lack of control. Investigators began to consider something more difficult to accept. A system, a silent method, repeated over months, perhaps years, sustained by the automatic trust of tired travelers and the absence of supervision in isolated regions. Nothing indicated haste. Nothing indicated improvisation. The relative identified as LC was never located. Some believe she was an accomplice. Others believe she was just another piece stuck in a cycle she couldn't escape. There are not enough records to confirm either version with certainty. The case was officially closed in 1907, classified as a multiple disappearance without conclusive resolution. No formal charges were made. No bodies were found. Smoky Ridge was slowly abandoned. The house, sold years later, ended up partially collapsing after a harsh winter, taking with it any physical evidence that might still remain. What remained were the documents, the unsent letters, the interrupted diaries, the side notes made by men who did not know they were recording someone's demise, and above all, the uncomfortable certainty that, for a long period, people voluntarily entered that attic, believing that the worst that could happen was just another sleepless night. This understanding changed the way the case was remembered, not as an outbreak of violence, but as something colder, more human, more difficult to explain. And that was exactly what made Smoky Ridge impossible to forget. Decades later, when Smoky Ridge was nothing more than a faded name on old maps, the case was mentioned again only in restricted academic circles, not as a sensational mystery, but as an extreme example of disappearances in isolated regions in the early 20th century. An event that left no bodies, produced no trials, and offered no officially recognized culprits. The researcher who compiled these records wrote in 1939 that the biggest obstacle was not the lack of evidence, but the excess of silence. The documents exist. They are there. Letters, notebooks, lists, testimonies. What does not exist is the exact moment when everything breaks down. There is no clear final scene, only interrupted continuities. Rereading the names one by one notices something common to almost all of them. No one was running away. None of them were wanted. They were not outlaws or reckless adventurers. They were ordinary people, in transit, trusting in customs that, until then, had worked, accepting shelter, eating in silence, sleeping under a stranger's roof. The attic at Smoky Ridge did not pose a threat. It offered a solution, an elevated space, away from the cold floor, far from the dampness of the forest. A place where a tired body could finally relax. This is perhaps the most difficult part to accept. Nothing there required excessive courage, just enough exhaustion. In the county's final files, there is a note written by an anonymous clerk, probably years after the case was closed. He offers no theories, no accusations. He simply notes, "There were no signs of resistance because no one believed they needed to resist." That sentence sums up everything the reports failed to explain. Smoky Ridge physically disappeared over time. The trails were overgrown with vegetation. The hillside collapsed in some places. The house collapsed, first the roof, then the interior walls, until the attic, that space that concentrated so many entrances and no exits, ceased to exist as a structure. Only the emptiness where it had been remained. Even so, the case is not truly closed. It remains in the gaps, in the names that never reached their destination, in the letters that were never sent, in the diaries that end mid-sentence. It remains as an uncomfortable reminder that not every disappearance is born of chaos or visible violence. Sometimes it stems from trust. And perhaps that is why, when studying Smoky Ridge, historians speak more softly, as if time was still listening, as if certain stories did not demand answers, but respect for the silence that replaced 38 voices. Nothing more was added to the archives after that, and nothing more needed to be said.